This comment right here is actually false. Buyer broker compensation is not required to be paid by the home buyer. It can still be paid by the seller. What has changed in this situation is exactly how the buyer broker gets paid. So in this video, we're going to break down what has changed with this new NAR settlement and buyer broker compensation. And we're also going to cover exactly what it changed from, which means we're going to go back in time to how things looked prior to this settlement having taken place. So that way you get a better understanding of why it changed and also how these changes will affect you with your home buying future. So in the past, a home seller would connect with a listing agent in which they would then come up with what's called a listing agreement. Now, it encompasses many different things on that agreement, but one of the biggest things that was on that agreement was also how much compensation was going to be for both the listing agent and also the buyer's agent, because the listing agent then has to take that property and put it on the MLS, the multiple listing service, which would also include how much money they were going to be offering to cover buyer broker compensation. This made it very easy for buyers agents to see how much money that they could potentially make in commissions before they actually ever take their client to see that property. And what this also created was potential opportunity for steering, because maybe a property offered more buyer broker compensation versus a different property, thus allowing them to make more money if they talk their client into buying that particular property. Now, let's say you were one of those home buyers, which I was you. I did buy a house during this period of the old way of doing things. This is kind of what it would look like in a transaction. A seller is going to obviously hand over the property to the home buyer. But then when it comes to the commissions, the total amount of commissions for both agents actually gets dispersed to the listing agent's broker. So in this example, as you can see on screen, if the total commissions were $10,000, all $10,000 actually went to the listing broker. And then the buyer broker would actually get compensated through the listing broker. This was what's known as cooperation compensation, or a co-op agreement. Now, with this whole NAR settlement, all of this has completely changed. So let's talk about the three agreements that go into a real estate transaction. The first is going to be a listing agreement, which we kind of talked about earlier. Then there's also going to be a buyer's agreement. And this is going to be between a potential home buyer and their buyer's agent. This buyer's agreement is actually now required to be signed for potential home buyers before they can go seeing a property, which means that gone are the days where you just call up a realtor and that realtor meets you at a property and they just show you a house without them having any form of agreement in place. The buyer's agreement is actually going to outline how much the buyer's agent could potentially be paid. Now, how much that agreement is going to entail is up to you and the agent you're working with, which means that you guys have the ability to now negotiate those terms. And then our last of the three major agreements is going to be the purchase agreement. A purchase agreement is between a home seller and a home buyer, but the negotiation of a purchase agreement is between the listing agent and the buyer's agent. It's kind of like, in some ways, like having an attorney. The listing agent and buyer's agent negotiate on behalf of their client's best interest to be able to help them get the best possible deal. Now, let's talk about how buyer broker compensation can be paid out. Well, the first way is going to be the way that all of you guys are thinking is going to be, which is you, the buyer, can pay for it yourself. The buyer technically has the ability to pay for their buyer broker compensation. Yes, this is one of the changes, but it is not the only change that is in place. And like our comment we showed in the beginning of the video, that would increase the potential closing costs, or at least the potential upfront costs to home ownership. But again, this is not required. This is just one of the many options. Now, option number two is this could still be paid for by the seller. Yes, sellers are still covering buyer broker compensation, but how they're covering it is completely different. You see, as I mentioned in the past, this was being listed on the MLS and then being paid through the cooperation compensation. But if a seller is going to cover this now, it's going to be required to be negotiated into the terms of the contract, which means that your buyer's agent is going to have to reach out to the listing agent before you actually make an offer to find out how much is being offered for buyer broker compensation, and then put that in the offer that you are making to the seller. Now, again, with buyer broker compensation, if the seller is going to cover it, they do have the ability to simply pay it out in the contract based on it being seller paid buyer broker compensation. Another way it could be done is going to be through what's called a credit. Let's say that the buyer broker compensation is $5,000, and then in the contract, the seller states that they're selling the house to you for X amount, but then they're also going to credit you $5,000 for your buyer broker compensation, essentially meaning you're going to pay it out, but you're just going to use the credit that you're receiving to do it. It essentially is the same as the seller just paying it themselves, but this is just one of the other ways it can also be done. A couple other ways this can also be paid is through one being where it's a dual payment. Maybe the seller is not willing to cover all of the buyer broker compensation. They're willing to cover half of it. In this example, we used $5,000, so we'll continue using that. Maybe the seller says, hey, I'm going to pay $2,500 for your buyer broker compensation, and it's up to you to cover the other $2,500. That's definitely doable. And then the $2,500 that you, the home buyer, would be responsible for would just be applied to your total closing costs. And then the other way this could also be done is not only through the home seller covering your buyer broker compensation, but maybe they're giving you a larger credit. For example, maybe you see that this is an opportunity for you to negotiate greater terms than just covering the buyer broker compensation. Maybe you want to try to get the seller to cover all of your closing costs as well. So you decide you're going to make an offer that the seller accepts where they're going to credit you $10,000. $5,000 for your buyer broker compensation and the other $5,000 to cover your closing costs. Well, that money now gets applied to your total closing costs, allowing you to cover both the closing costs and the buyer broker compensation as well. So you made it this long in the video and now you're thinking, well, Josh, why don't I just represent myself? Why even have to pay buyer broker compensation at all? I can just communicate directly with the listing agent and actually do all the negotiating all by myself. Sure, you could definitely do that. The major reason why I don't think working with the listing agent is going to be a great way to save money is actually because the listing agent owes what's called a fiduciary duty to the individual that they have the listing agreement with, and that's going to be the home seller. The listing agent cannot have a listing agreement and a buyer's agreement with two individuals for the same property because that would be what's called a conflict of interest. How are you going to negotiate the best possible terms for each of your clients without potentially muddying the waters by looking out for your interest? They can only have the best interest of one person being their client. So the client is the person they have the agreement with. In this case, it would be the seller. And if you decide to work with a listing agent, you still can, but you now become what's called a customer, which means that they do owe you factual and honest information, but they don't necessarily owe you the best possible outcome because the client that they owe that to is the seller. So now that you understand how fiduciary works, you're now going to get a better understanding for the next things I'm going to talk about. The listing agent's job is to get it sold for the most amount of money and the quickest way they possibly can to look out for their seller's best interest, which means that if you're going to try to find different ways to get out of that contract, what you need to remember is the listing agent is going to be doing everything they can to keep you in that contract. Now, of course, if they do want to help you find other houses, guess what they're going to want you to sign? A buyer broker compensation agreement that is going to allow them to represent you for other potential properties, but not for this particular property. Now, sure, them representing you for other properties does give you that fiduciary duty, but then what's going to happen is you're going to find yourself back in the same situation you would have been had you had your own agent to begin with that was there to look out for your best interest all along. If you want to work with a VA knowledgeable realtor in your area that is going to look out for your best interest and not just trying to push you to buy a property that you don't want, reach out to me and my team down below. We'll be happy to connect you with a realtor in your local market. The last thing, remember this, which is most important: Jesus loves you and he paid the ultimate price for your life. So if you turn to him, trust in him, and believe in him, he has a beautiful plan and purpose for you and your family.